They say some people marry for love and others marry for legacy. Charlotte married me for neither. She married me for access. When I first saw her, she was standing by the bar at a private fundraiser for an urban arts program I had discreetly sponsored. I wasn't there to meet anyone. I rarely stayed longer than was socially necessary. But she caught my eye, not because of her beauty, which was obvious and well deployed, but because of how calculated her stillness was. She wasn't trying to be noticed. She was trying to be noticed by the right person. She wore her ambition like a silk slip under her skin, barely visible, but unmistakable once you looked closely. We spoke briefly. Her background was deliberately vague. She'd done some work in brand strategy and PR, dabbled in consulting, and had recently transitioned into creative partnerships. Her vocabulary was polished but devoid of weight. At the time, I mistook that for charm. In retrospect, it was camouflage. She didn't ask about what I did. She already knew. That was the first red flag. Not that she'd done her research, that was expected, but that she pretended not to. It told me her performance had rehearsals. That was her game. Still, I let it happen. In the months that followed, we fell into a rhythm. I introduced her to my circle, discreet, affluent, and allergic to drama. She wore it like a costume, never quite fitting in, but always convincing enough to pass. She complimented my mother's pearls, laughed politely at boardroom jokes, and made soft, calculated suggestions about how we could diversify our social engagements to include younger, trendier events. I let her, because I wanted to believe she was building a bridge between my old-world structure and her modern spontaneity. By the time I proposed, under a cypress tree in Florence, in a house I partially owned but never boasted about, I had already begun to suspect the truth. But suspicion, like rot, doesn't cause collapse immediately. It simmers. It spreads. And sometimes it fools even the careful ones into silence. The marriage was elegant, tasteful. A guest list of 50, no press, no drama. Charlotte wore a minimalist gown with sharp lines and no veil. Her vows were poetic. Mine were honest. She kissed me like a transaction sealed. I told myself love looked different in every generation. Maybe this was ours. Then came the pattern, the one I refused to acknowledge for too long. Private flights I didn't authorize. Boutique businesses advised by people I'd never met. A growing social media presence she had once dismissed as silly. Charlotte began hosting events, not for us, but for herself. Branding salons, fashion brunches, off-the-record networking retreats in coastal villas I never saw. She began traveling without notice, citing vague collaborations and partnerships. Always female-led, always vague. She asked for little directly. No arguments, no conflict. That was her brilliance. She simply existed in a parallel lane, funded by my infrastructure, buffered by my reputation. I never raised my voice. I kept our finances separate enough to protect the essentials, but not enough to fully protect me. And as I watched her charm her way into higher social strata, I began the process of building walls where she saw windows. The first thing I did was revisit our prenup. It had been standard at the time, clean, enforceable, protective. But now I revised it with surgical precision. I inserted clauses she would never read, performance-based conditions tied to marital fidelity, non-disparagement agreements, ownership structures around shared property, and my favorite, a media confidentiality clause with escalating penalties for public statements about our marriage. Then I began reshuffling our real estate. The condo in Tribeca, which she once called our urban sanctuary, was quietly retitled into a multi-member LLC with a transfer clause that allowed me to revoke occupancy without cause. I created a complex trail of asset protection vehicles. Family limited partnerships, holding companies, and shell corporations registered in jurisdictions that didn't blink at discretion. I wasn't preparing to leave her. I was preparing to let her try and leave me. And when she did, publicly, brazenly, and without warning, I was ready. Charlotte filed for divorce on a Thursday. I remember because the courier who delivered the papers smiled nervously, as if he expected a scene. But there was no scene. I was drinking my second espresso, reading a quarterly report. I took the envelope, thanked him, and returned to my seat. The papers were printed on thick stock. Her name was written with the same flourish she used on thank you cards and RSVP notes. What struck me first wasn't the demand, it was the confidence. She was asking for full rights to the Tribeca property, a $20,000 monthly stipend, ownership of her personal businesses, and, most brazenly, continued access to our European properties for personal and professional use. The language was audacious, not desperate, entitled. Attached was a press statement, not a draft, a final version, ready to release. Charlotte Hayes to part ways with financier husband in graceful transition of independent growth. It read like an obituary for a marriage she'd long buried. She painted herself as a woman emerging from the shadows of privilege to claim her own narrative. Carefully worded, subtly scathing. The kind of post that circulates among influencers and magazine editors. I knew the publications that would run it. I knew the podcast that would invite her on. She hadn't left me. She had outgrown me. That was her line. I said nothing. Instead, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to my estate attorney. The second to my private accountant. The third to the firm I'd retained 2 years earlier when I suspected Charlotte would someday try this. Within 48 hours, she found herself locked out of the Tribeca condo. Not evicted. Just removed. Her keycard no longer worked. The doorman had clear instructions. The building manager, a quiet man named Victor who owed me more than a favor, had the locks changed and her belongings boxed with museum-level care. She received the delivery 2 days later, alongside a legal notice citing her violation of the occupancy clause under LLC guidelines. Her attorney called, blustering. "This will get messy," he warned. "No," my attorney replied. "It will get precise." The businesses she claimed as her own, Charlotte and Company. Lifestyle, Maison Hazel, several influencer-based affiliate companies, were not hers. I had funded them through convertible notes tied to performance milestones. She hadn't met a single one, which meant I owned controlling interest in all of them. Quietly, legally, and now, irrevocably. I called the bank managers. Credit lines were suspended. The Amex Black she flaunted at luncheons? Canceled. Her team, assistant, stylist, PR girl, were informed their contracts were tied to the ventures, and that those ventures were now entering liquidation. The stylist emailed a curt, "Thanks for the clarity." The PR girl tried to pivot to me. I didn't reply. Charlotte went silent for 3 days. Then came the storm. She posted a cryptic message on Instagram, a black square, no caption, but tagged with phrases like healing, transition, and truth finds light. The likes were fewer than usual. Comments, mostly from women who aspired to her lifestyle, offered virtual hugs and fire emojis. But the real audience, the ones who mattered, were already pulling away. Her curated world was shrinking, and she felt it. She issued a formal response through her attorney, insisting on mediation, reiterating her public image is a joint marital asset, and hinting at reputational damage if not handled with mutual dignity. It was too late for dignity. I filed a counterclaim for marital fraud. The media never got the story they were waiting for. No bitter statements, no emotional rebuttals. Just silence from me and increasing desperation from Charlotte. Behind closed doors, however, I was methodically tearing down the empire she had tried to build on my name. The counterclaim for marital fraud wasn't performative, it was strategic. I submitted a comprehensive forensic report with the court, including over 200 pages of financial records, flagged wire transfers, credit card logs, and confidential memos. Everything from a $16,000 consulting payment to a social media strategist who was actually her personal brand manager, to a private jet invoice for a flight to Lake Como disguised as a collaborative wellness summit. Each transaction, each inconsistency, was annotated with date, location, and context. The linchpin was an offshore transfer she made to a holding company registered under her cousin's name. The money had originated from one of our joint accounts, marked as a family emergency. I provided proof the cousin was in Bali on a sponsored retreat at the time. That one detail alone carried enough weight to put her on the defensive. Charlotte's legal team tried to claim ignorance. She was unaware of the restrictions outlined in the revised agreement, they argued. But ignorance does not negate fraud, especially when the plaintiff can prove due process. Every amendment had been signed, digitally, time-stamped, notarized, on file. When I submitted the non-disparagement clause she had violated with her public statement, the judge didn't need to be convinced. Charlotte's own PR release became Exhibit A. She attempted to counter with emotional claims. Years of being emotionally diminished, silenced, a partner in shadow. But emotional testimony doesn't stand against financial fraud. Not in the courts I deal with. Especially not when I showed that her silent suffering was accompanied by luxury retreats, first-class travel, and brand collaborations where I was the silent investor and she was the face. The court froze her remaining accounts, and a hearing was scheduled to determine restitution. It was a formality. Her attorney knew it. The tone of their correspondence changed. Now they were begging for discretion. Meanwhile, I went public. Not through interviews or Instagram, but through a carefully written, deliberately dry op-ed in a respected financial magazine. The piece was titled, "The Cost of Reputation When Wealth is Weaponized Against Trust." I never mentioned Charlotte by name. I didn't have to. Those who mattered recognized the narrative. They saw the shape of her silhouette in my words. And that was enough. Within a week, her remaining endorsements were suspended. Board invitations rescinded. Even her alumni association removed her from their annual donor gala. Reputation is currency, and Charlotte had gone bankrupt. Then came the real blow. I filed a civil judgment to recover $346,000 in misappropriated funds, plus legal fees. Her team tried to settle out of court. I refused. I wanted it documented. On record. A permanent reminder. A public footnote she could never scrub from her history. She had built her identity on the illusion of success. Now she had to live in its ruins. By the time the judgment was finalized, Charlotte no longer recognized the world she had once orchestrated. Her social calendar, once filled with curated invitations and strategic alignments, now stood empty. She had tried to pivot, rebranding herself as a wellness advocate, then as a female empowerment coach, and finally, a discreet consultant for luxury alignment. None of it stuck. The silence from her former allies was absolute. They hadn't simply rejected her. They had revised her out of their narrative. And that, more than the money, was what she truly lost: presence. I didn't attend the final hearing. My presence wasn't needed. My attorney stood before the judge and calmly outlined the damages. Charlotte sat quietly, lips drawn, her once dazzling appearance dulled by fatigue and consequence. When the ruling was read, she didn't cry. That part of her, I think, had calcified. She signed the order. Her signature was shaky. She owed me $346,000, enforceable through wage garnishment, asset seizure, or lien placement. In practice, I would recover very little of it. That wasn't the point. The judgment was a brand, one she would carry into every background check, every loan application, every corporate vetting process. It was a permanent footnote in the margins of her story. I went home that evening to my estate outside Sag Harbor. The fireplace was lit, the floors quiet. I poured a drink, Amaro, over a single cube, and stood by the window, watching the last light bleed across the trees. There was no music, no celebration, just the rhythmic ticking of the old Cartier clock on the mantel. And that was enough. People imagine revenge as a fiery act, something done in rage or spectacle. But real revenge, the kind that changes the air in a room, is quiet. It moves like fog. It waits, and then it leaves nothing untouched. Charlotte married me to ascend, to build a name atop mine and launch herself into a life she hadn't earned. And for a time, I let her believe she had one. Because that belief was necessary. It made her careless. It made her build without reading the blueprints. She never understood that while she played the crowd, I was scripting the architecture of her downfall. She's still alive somewhere. Renting, I imagine. Rebuilding. Telling herself a new version of the story where she was the victim of cruelty or misunderstanding or male ego. That's fine. Let her. But her story no longer touches mine. I didn't just outlast her. I erased her. And when people ask what happened to Charlotte Hayes, they don't ask me. They ask each other, quietly, as if her name is a mistake someone once made in a world that no longer remembers her. That, I've learned, is the final act of power, not vengeance. Oblivion. For those who've been broken, rebuilt, and learned to move in silence, these stories are for you. Subscribe for more first-person tales of betrayal, revenge, and reinvention. Quiet power, legal precision, emotional truth, one story at a time.